NASA says that right presently is a mind-blowing, basic chance to zero in on the world Venus. This follows the new divulgences of conceivable life on the planet. Assuming you, some way or another, wind up examining NASA's records from the 1960s, you'd see the space organization calling Venus a planet of judgment. In the interim, Mars turned into our essential objective. Such cautious naming of the primary planets wasn't ordinary during the wild space race period. The Soviet Union was centered around sending missions to Venus. The stunning planet showed virtually no potential for life, yet the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the USSR. Because of Neil deGrasse Tyson, we at last grasp the reason why. Go along with us as we examine the declassified photographs from Venus taken by the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union was huge in more ways than one. Not only did it change the worldwide course of the world, but the breakdown of the USSR also sealed away many mysteries. The truth that the Soviets had a deep inclination for maintaining mysteries, from running the most quick intelligence association in the world to being strange about their true capacities, proposes that extraterrestrial contact was one of those privileged secrets. The former superpower holds numerous untold secrets. Before the US outperformed all planetary missions in space, the Soviet Union was leading the game. While the USSR had a long history of both successful and failed space missions, its most renowned focus was on the very unfriendly planet Venus. In the Russian language, you'd see Venus as Venera, which is also the name of the mission that endured from 1961 to 1983. During the same time, the US was caught up with sending its missions to the moon. In a manner, the Soviets chose to use their assets elsewhere. We can't say that the entire fixation on the second planet from our sun is odd. Did the Soviets want to utilize the planet's surface as a potential power station? Or were they perhaps hoping to colonize the planet after searching for any signs of movement beneath the surface? The question remains, why were the Soviets so focused on this severe planet? As they conducted these missions during the Cold War, they weren't completely open about their objectives. In fact, all that we know about the Venusian missions comes from declassified and unarchived data. By the way, after so much effort pinpointing what is challenging, the Soviets were actually searching for and whether they ever revealed the secrets of Venus. The Soviets didn't land on Venus once or even twice, but commonly, that's true. The Soviets launched 28 expensive rockets toward the planet. Additionally, 13 of those entered the Venusian air, while 8 actually landed. Such complex missions put the Soviets in a leading position in space exploration. Sure, the US was a close second, but NASA was more focused on satellites and innovative technology than on looking for life on other planets. Their attention was on Mars, which, in turn, wasn't especially unusual or particularly bad. Your history course might not tell you this, but the Soviet space program was the first to send a probe into the air of a planet other than Earth. It also had another series of firsts to its name. The USSR became the first country to achieve a soft landing on another planet, returning pictures and sounds from the surface of that planet. In fact, the Soviets had their own one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind moment long before the US. So, why do we seldom hear about such accomplishments? Well, remember what we said about the Soviet affinity for maintaining secrets. That's only one of many reasons for the oversight of the Soviet space program. In 1992, the famous office was decommissioned following the breakdown of the USSR, and the program had to be restored under another Russian identity, Roscosmos. Many of its original records were either lost or destroyed. This is exactly why we don't have a clear answer regarding why the Soviets launched 28 rockets into Venus' atmosphere. Still, we can make the most sensible assumption. Perhaps the Soviet decision to explore Venus was more about cost efficiency than anything else. It's not to say that the space program didn't recognize the planet's true potential. They were searching for sensible water levels, sunlight radiation, and the general characteristics of the planet. Without a series of these space missions, it would have been extraordinarily difficult to assess Venus' high temperatures and thick climate. Today, many astronomers don't believe that the unfriendly planet could support life. The temperatures there are high enough to melt lead, and water is scant. Furthermore, because of its thick atmosphere, the atmospheric pressure on Venus is approximately 90 times that of Earth. Anyway, there are still ongoing advancements, and to disregard the USSR's contribution to the investigation of Venus is to rewrite history. As far as the Soviets were concerned, Venus was worth investigating. Even though energizing the space race by looking at other, more friendly planets like Mars wasn't entirely unfeasible, it was more expensive than sending probes to Venus. Everything basically comes down to the distance from Earth to another celestial body. On average, the unfriendly planet is just 40 million kilometers away from our home, while Mars is, on average, 250 million kilometers away. Such gigantic contrasts in distance result in colossal differences in cost. Had the US not been the world's largest economy, it may have never even explored Mars with such ease. Different reports suggest that Soviet missions were dangerous and had significant technical gaps. Of course, the rockets weren't able to cover huge distances. Besides, the organization had a poor history of losing contact with its rockets. So, it makes sense why the Soviet space program picked a more prudent and somewhat closer mission that would yield results. Anyway, if we don't consider the space race in this context, the story of the Venera missions would be incomplete. The US wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This move started off the space race and kept its momentum. What's especially interesting is why the US focused on the Moon instead of Venus. NASA had a series of failures with its Venus missions during the 1960s, and consequently, the US Space Agency hit a detour known as the Venus Curse. Each time they launched a probe into Venus' atmosphere, it failed. This was precisely when the Soviet Union saw an amazing opportunity to capitalize on NASA's failures. Around that time, both the US and the USSR were determined to win the space race. The best strategy was to take advantage of two particular opportunities. It was a quiet yet conclusive methodology. The Soviet space program seized Earth's sister planet as its first triumph in the space race, achieving something its primary opponent had failed to do. Regardless of the Soviet Union's limited resources and faltering government, they repeatedly launched missions to Venus to maintain their leading position over the US. In contrast to NASA's focus on the Moon, this key decision wasn't without ill will. Moreover, clever publicity was used to cloud their significant failures with Venus. The American government was prompted to investigate the USSR's obsession with the planet, with the media labeling Venus the evil planet, while Mars became humanity's destiny. These names didn't matter to the Soviets. Their mission was to show their supremacy over the Americans, and they succeeded in doing so. The Venera missions are almost forgotten in modern history, but regardless of their early challenges, these missions were extraordinarily advanced, high-tech, and aggressive. At the beginning of the space age, the Venera missions led the way. Back in the 1950s, the Soviets began testing the plans and technical details of the probes. Over the next 30 years, they proceeded to build and launch interplanetary spacecraft as part of the Venera program. Since the program ran alongside a wild Cold War, the Soviets focused on improving their assets. Luckily for them, the early years of the conflict provided them with more resources than the US, which turned out to be incredibly valuable. It allowed them to build larger rockets designed to break through high altitudes and cover huge distances. The Soviets hurried to experiment with both manned and unmanned rockets, while the Soviet scholarly community worked on a series of measurements and assessments to make accurate routes for the Venus missions. In the background, their Mars programs were also running. Nothing was more important than developing advanced instrumentation for these missions. This led to significant breakthroughs in the history of space exploration. In 1966, the Soviet Union launched Venera 3, making it the first artificial probe to enter the atmosphere of Venus and successfully land on the planet's surface. This achievement raised the competition between the two superpowers. Unlike the American missions, which were plagued by failures and mishaps, the Soviet program continued to make progress. Despite their triumphs, the USSR managed to send successful probes into Venus' atmosphere. The only point of conflict with this approach was the limited design capabilities. The Soviets quickly overcame their design issues and launched the most advanced probes of the Venera program during the 1970s. Their pioneering efforts allowed them to achieve the first simultaneous launches of Venera 4 and Venera 5. According to most history specialists, this was the most surprising decade in the history of space exploration. Without a doubt, the US tried to develop similar launch techniques. So, why did the Soviet agency choose simultaneous launches into Venus? To understand this, you need to recognize that interplanetary travel requires advanced instrumentation to gather the highest level of data and evidence. The probes were initially launched to study the planet's surface, and that's exactly what happened with Venera 4. Since the launch went flawlessly, the probe successfully entered Venus' atmosphere. The Soviet program continued with Venera 5, but this wasn't just a repeat of the first launch. The second probe was specifically designed to collect detailed data about the planet. Eventually, Venera 7, the final successful launch, managed to make history by being the first space probe to land successfully on Venus. The entire mission represented an intense rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US. The Cold War space race never slowed down. The achievement of Venera 7 was a monumental milestone. It became the first spacecraft to send back signals from the surface of Venus, a feat that had eluded NASA and other space agencies. It transmitted data for over 23 minutes before losing contact, which was a remarkable success given the extreme conditions on the planet. This victory was part of the USSR's broader strategy to showcase its superiority in space exploration, at a time when the US was focused on its moon missions. However, the Soviet successes did not come without their setbacks. While the Venera probes were crucial for Venus exploration, they were also plagued with challenges. For instance, the harsh environment on Venus, with its thick atmosphere, extreme heat, and crushing pressure, made it difficult to maintain communication and keep the probes functioning for long periods. Despite these challenges, the Soviets kept pushing forward with their missions. Venera 9, launched in 1975, succeeded in sending back the first black-and-white images from the surface of Venus, further cementing the USSR's leadership in planetary exploration. The Soviet space program's work on Venus wasn't just about outdoing the US. It was also about gathering vital scientific knowledge. The Venera probes helped to establish that Venus had a surface temperature of about 465 degrees Celsius, 869 degrees Fahrenheit, far too hot for any Earth-like life to exist. The probes also confirmed that the planet's atmosphere was primarily composed of carbon dioxide, with clouds of sulfuric acid, making it one of the most inhospitable places in the solar system. Despite this harsh environment, some scientists have continued to speculate about the possibility of life in Venus' upper cloud layers, where conditions might be more temperate. Recent discoveries, such as the detection of phosphine gas in Venus' atmosphere, have reignited interest in the planet. This has led to renewed efforts by space agencies like NASA, ESA, and Russia to send new missions to Venus, as scientists hope to learn more about its history and whether life ever existed there. The Venera program, though now largely forgotten in popular memory, was a pioneering effort that provided much of the first concrete data about Venus. The Soviet Union's commitment to these missions demonstrated their resolve in the space race, and their technical achievements in planetary exploration laid the groundwork for future missions to both Venus and other planets. With the collapse of the USSR and the cessation of the Venera program, Venus exploration slowed down. NASA's focus shifted to Mars, and much of the scientific community turned its attention elsewhere. But as we look to the future, Venus may once again take center stage. With new technologies and international collaboration, the mysteries of this hellish planet may yet reveal more secrets, ones that could change our understanding of life in the universe. In the end, the Soviet space program's successes on Venus remain an important chapter in the history of space exploration. It was a time when technological ambition and geopolitical competition drove humanity to explore new worlds, and the legacy of those efforts continues to inspire today's space missions.